Hello, Professor Morgan here with a video that talks about writing settings and how genre can have an impact and make a big difference on the approach and take when it comes to writing settings. So let's get to it, shall we? Yes, we shall. All right. Basically, when we're talking about setting, it's the world or worlds in which the characters live or exist. Now, the Earth is a big place, and a lot of stories take place on Earth, but they will take place in different locations. And having lived different places around the world, including out of the country, I will to out of America. It's the world is a very diverse place, and in some stories it can get even more diverse as we're talking about made up worlds, stories that are in outer space, or any number of things. So the setting can have a huge impact on the story and how we need to approach it. Now, a common rule of thumb is that speculative fiction tends to need more time, meaning more words, spent on describing setting. And that, speculative fiction really referring to science fiction or fantasy, magical realism, and I would say even kind of like, maybe historical fiction, because we're talking about areas or, ideas that may or may not be familiar with the reader, especially if you're creating something completely from scratch as far as the world and doing world building. And so they tend to be, speculative fiction tends books to be a little bit bigger, just because there needs to be a little more information on the world and the setting in which it happens. Now, we're going to look at some examples of detail and kind of some approaches you can take. So let's take a deep breath here because this should be fun. Here we go. Ready for this? Woo! Tall, thick green grass grew wildly and ferociously around the aged, worn-down, reddish-brownish brick estate, which had been in its prime when big band music filled the airwaves, and people chanted for the war, the final war to end all wars, to come to a bitter and unfulfilling conclusion. Linens, spotted and torn from overuse and neglect, hung from a clothesline, flapping anxiously in the midsummer breeze, as if they could not wait to once again return indoors, away from the threat of the impending rain, even if that meant returning to the decrepit house. Great googly moogly, that's a lot of detail, okay? So there's a lot of information packed in here, okay? Now we're going to compare this amount of detail and what it's to start describing in a different way. You ready for this one? The house looked old. Okay, so if all that we're really trying to do is describe that the setting is an old house, okay, which one of those is better? Well, it's gonna kind of depend on the story and what's being told, and is the house play a big important role in the I mean, I just whatever. So which is the better approach? Well, we're gonna go with one of my favorite ways of doing this. I called this the Goldilocks approach. For those who are familiar, you should be, not should be. There's people who aren't familiar with Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but basically the story is that Goldilocks is walking through the forest and she finds a house that is owned by three bears, a mama, papa, and a baby bear. And as they're not home, they're out. I don't know, doing what bears do when they're not home. And she goes and there's food on the table, and she tries one of the things of food and it's too hot, and then she tries one and it's too cold, and then she tries another plate of food and it's just right, just right. Okay, and then she moves on, and there's different things like chairs and like a bed, and like one of the beds is too hard, and one of the beds is too soft, and one of the beds is just right amount. So how much detail should you include in a story? Just right. So that first example I gave you was probably too much. And the second one I gave you was probably not enough, And it really kind of depends on, again, the story you're telling and how much the setting in plays with that type of writing. Okay, and again, these are general things because there are different types of styles. But we're going to look at three books really quickly to kind of show different examples of the approach of setting, and I'm familiar with these books because, well, I happen to have written them. Okay, so we're going to look at national bestseller, Bring Down the Rain, and The Hidden Sun. So these are three books. Little different approach in each single one. And no, I'm not. This is not a shameless plug. It's just, for me to be able to actually say, what did the author mean? Well, I'll tell you because I am the author. So we're going to look at the different books really quickly and kind of the approach that was taken as far as setting. Based on the story. So the first story here is national bestseller that we're going to talk about. So this actually came out in 2020. So and it was written contemporarily in what was going on in 2020. Actually, it was written before COVID came out. So it was actually written in 2019. So but it uses basically the same technology, the same things that we deal with in everyday life, right? Still, a few years later. And it takes place in North Carolina, though it really could be really almost anywhere, America. It's not super rural, it's not super urban or anything like that. So there wasn't a lot of time that I had to spend on world building because it was just one of those things. I didn't have to describe what a cell phone was and what a cell phone could do. Because we know. And so I could spend more time on the characters and the development and less on the setting. Okay. And that's just the nature of writing contemporary fiction. Okay. The next book is Bring Down the Rain. So, this one actually, I wrote this as this is my thesis novel actually for my, MFA degree. And, so, even though I wrote it, in the 2000s. I won't say exactly when I graduated. Actually, it's in my CV. I graduated with my MFA in 2014. All right. But I wrote this book, and it takes place in the years between 1987 and 1988. And the main character, Derek, is basically, he's a senior in high school. It just so happens that I, went to school, during these years, and that shows how old I am, right? So even though there's a lot that's very similar to our world in which we live now, there's a lot that's different, especially with the technology and stuff that we may take for granted. I mean, as far as like, there's no texting. There was, if you called somebody's house, if they had multiple phones, you could have someone who could listen in on another phone and all the stuff that comes along with that. So, so there was a little more world building that had to be done here, simply because for people who aren't aware of that time frame, then it needed to be explained. And actually, people who've read this book that have lived during that time, especially folks that are my same age, they felt a big sense of nostalgia from kind of reliving life back at that during that time. So there's that. All right, and then we're going to look at The Hidden Sun. Now, this is actually my very first book that I wrote. And it was completely out of the world. I mean, I had to do the full world building. It takes place in an Earth-like setting, but it doesn't necessarily take place on Earth. There's no magic involved in it, but it takes place kind of like with medieval settings. You can see there's a castle. I mean, I actually wrote, it's a young adult book, and I wrote it for my children that I have. And actually, it was, it did very well, and very proud of this book, and a lot of people really like it and stuff like this. It's the first book in a trilogy, but I had to spend a lot more time world building because I had to establish, even though it really kind of, it's like it could be somewhere in, let's say, anywhere in the world, but it had its own set of rules as far as how the government runs and what kind of transportation was used, and whatever. And my main goal, one of my main goals in writing the story that used this, is that I wanted to have characters deal with challenges that they couldn't solve using technology, or advanced technology, I should say, or magic. And so that was intentional on that behalf. But the book was a lot longer, whereas the previous two books that we talked about were about 75,000 words. This book ended up, it was more like 100,000 words. And part of it was because the story was a little more epic in nature. Yet a lot of it was because of the world building. And so it required a little more attention to it. So some final thoughts is, really when it comes to writing your setting, the nature of the book and what you're going to be telling is going to determine a lot of that, the genre that you work in. And there is going to be a stylistic choice as a writer. There've been a lot of books that I've read that are very minimalistic as far as setting. They do have a basic setup, but there's a lot of dialogue and there's a lot of, human interactions. That's the focus of the story. And then you have writers like Robert Jordan, who wrote the Wheel of Time series, who can spend, the joke is that he can spend 80 pages describing someone walking across the room. It's extremely detailed. And people love that, they enjoy that as well. So, I would say, really, if you're trying to figure out what's the best fit, read a lot of books in the genre in which you want to write. And kind of get a sense of what they do and how they incorporate setting, and have it just be part of the story. There, it gives you the sense of setting without being overly bogged down by it. So anyway, there you go. Thank you so much.